A marriage doesn't always end with shouting. Sometimes it dissolves in silence. The breaking point follows Rachel, a devoted wife and mother, whose husband retreats into work and refuses the one thing that could save them: therapy. She pleads, she waits, she hopes, but his indifference becomes unbearable. Alone, she steps into a therapist's office, finds her voice, and makes the hardest choice: to leave. Through grief, resolve, and the courage to rebuild, Rachel discovers freedom is not the absence of love, but the presence of self. This is a story of endings that open into beginnings. Let's begin the story. The morning began the way most mornings did now, with Rachel moving through the kitchen as if she lived alone. The silence pressed against her ears more heavily than any sound, filling the air like fog. The refrigerator hummed, the coffee maker dripped, and she placed 2 slices of bread in the toaster, waiting for the soft click that signaled readiness. Across the room, Mark sat hunched over his laptop, a spoon resting in his cereal bowl, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. She moved around him like an invisible guest, collecting Emily's lunchbox, slipping the sandwich inside, fastening the zipper. The rhythm of their routine looked, from the outside, like order. Inside, it felt like absence. The tension had not erupted overnight. It had gathered in increments, arriving like water dripping steadily from a loose faucet. At first, she hardly noticed. An unanswered question here, a dismissive shrug there. But over the years, the trickle became a steady stream, soaking into everything, until she felt permanently damp with disappointment. Rachel knew she was not blameless. She had been quieter than she once was, her laughter less frequent, her gestures more measured. But she could not ignore the fact that she had been speaking into a void for years. She had begged for openness, asked for honesty, pleaded for effort. He had given her silence in return. The morning's smallest details reminded her of what they had lost. The way he scrolled on his phone instead of meeting her eyes. The way he rose from the table before she could speak, carrying his coffee upstairs, as though the day demanded his attention more than she ever could. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, a private pulse of grief that never fully left her. Once, years ago, mornings had been different. He used to lean against the counter, teasing her about the way she buttered toast unevenly. He used to wrap his arms around her waist, pressing his chin into her shoulder while she packed Emily's lunch. Those gestures had disappeared gradually, like fading paint. She kept searching for them, hoping one morning they would return. Instead, she stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the echo of his footsteps vanish up the stairs. Conflict had rooted itself in their marriage, not through shouting, but through absence. Rachel had always believed arguments could be repaired. Words, however sharp, carried the possibility of resolution. But silence felt like a locked door. She pressed her hand against it every day, finding no way in. Her frustration mounted each time she considered therapy. She had spent weeks building the courage to ask him, to suggest that perhaps someone could help them find the words they had lost. Each time he dismissed the idea before it formed, as if her request were ridiculous. She remembered standing in the kitchen one evening, feeling her throat tighten while he waved her suggestion away, comparing therapy to weakness. The sting of that rejection had never left. The refusal was not about therapy alone. It was about refusal to face her. Refusal to admit that something between them had cracked. Refusal to believe their love required care. To Rachel, the rejection felt like a verdict. He would rather watch the marriage decay than step into a room where honesty might be demanded. That knowledge followed her through the day. At work, she smiled at students and guided them through teenage crises, her voice steady, her advice thoughtful. She poured her energy into helping others find words for their pain, all the while carrying her own silence like an anchor. She drove home with a sinking awareness that no one at home waited to meet her halfway. That evening, when she folded laundry on the bed, she felt the weight of her wedding ring against her skin. The band seemed heavier than usual, pressing into her finger with a reminder she could not ignore. The house around her was quiet, Mark locked in his office, Emily asleep upstairs. Rachel looked at the ring and realized she wore not a promise but a memory. The crack in the foundation had widened beyond repair. She did not need a fight to know it. She lived with the fracture every day, stepping carefully to avoid falling through. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body rigid against the emptiness on the other side of the mattress. She knew then what she had been circling for months. She could not survive a marriage built on silence. She had been waiting for him to notice, to try, to choose her again. He would not. The realization settled over her like cold air. It startled her not because it was new, but because she finally accepted it as truth. The marriage had already ended in spirit. All that remained was the courage to acknowledge it in action. Rachel woke before dawn, the house still and heavy with quiet. She slipped from bed and padded down the hallway, careful not to disturb Emily's sleep. The child's soft breathing reached her through the cracked door, steady and untroubled. That sound had become Rachel's anchor, proof that something in her world still moved with rhythm and innocence. Downstairs, the kitchen lights hummed against the early gray outside. Rachel moved quickly, pouring cereal into a bowl, slicing fruit, sliding a juice box into the lunch bag. Her hands worked from memory, her body performing tasks without thought. She had repeated these motions for years, but the repetition no longer comforted her. It only reminded her how routine had replaced connection. When Emily wandered in, hair tangled, eyes still half closed, Rachel bent to kiss her head. Emily leaned against her side, mumbling a good morning before settling at the table. Rachel felt warmth spread through her chest. With Emily, everything remained clear. Love expressed itself in touch, in attention, in the smallest gestures. Mark entered minutes later, dressed in his pressed shirt and dark slacks, already clutching his travel mug. He nodded at Emily, offered Rachel a brief glance, then reached for the keys on the counter. His phone buzzed, and he disappeared out the door before Rachel could form words. The silence after his departure carried more weight than his presence. Rachel felt it spread through the house like fog, filling corners, seeping into walls. She cleaned the counter, folded the dish towel, packed her own bag for work. Each action became an answer to the question she never spoke aloud. What remains when a marriage turns into an arrangement? On her drive to school, the memories crept in. Years earlier, mornings had been different. Mark used to sit across from her, sipping coffee slowly, offering casual stories about coworkers and projects. He used to reach for her hand across the table. He used to laugh. The contrast between then and now cut sharp against her ribs. She carried that ache into her office, where students waited with their own stories. Anxiety over exams, fear of rejection, heartbreak after first loves. Rachel leaned in, listening, guiding, steady. She spoke with calm authority, offering strategies and reassurance. And yet each piece of advice left an aftertaste. A bitterness that came from giving others the tools she could not use at home. She reminded students that communication built trust, but she returned every evening to a house where words dissolved before they reached the air. That evening, after Emily settled in with her books, Rachel prepared dinner alone. She chopped vegetables with deliberate force, each slice echoing in the quiet kitchen. Mark arrived late, offered a distracted smile, then carried his plate into the office. The clatter of his fork against ceramic drifted down the hallway, proof of his presence but not his participation. Rachel sat with Emily, forcing her smile to remain soft. They ate together while cartoons flickered in the background. Emily laughed, her eyes lighting up at silly characters, her voice filling the room with a joy Rachel both cherished and envied. After bedtime, Rachel cleaned the kitchen once more, the routine stretching endlessly into the night. Upstairs, she lingered by the closed office door, listening to the muted clicks of Mark's keyboard. She imagined him behind the desk, eyes locked on data, head bent toward numbers that never rejected him, tasks that always provided results. Work rewarded him. Work listened. She, on the other hand, had become background noise. In bed, Rachel stared at the ceiling until her eyes blurred. The silence wrapped around her again, pressing against her chest. She measured her breaths, steady but shallow, as if matching the rhythm of absence itself. She thought about how relationships rarely shattered in one blow. They eroded, grain by grain, until the foundation gave way. She remembered how, years earlier, they had painted this very bedroom together, splattering the walls with uneven strokes, laughing at their mistakes. She had felt certain then that love could outlast anything. But paint faded. Walls cracked. Memories offered no shelter. The night stretched long, the space beside her empty once again. Rachel knew she could not live indefinitely in this quiet unraveling. The silence had become more than discomfort, it had become suffocation. And beneath that suffocation, a new thought pulsed. Survival might require escape. The week unraveled in small repetitions. The clatter of dishes, the muted hum of Mark's office door shutting, the soft weight of Emily's arms around her neck at bedtime. Rachel moved through each moment with precision, almost as if she followed choreography designed by someone else. Yet beneath the pattern, pressure built like water pressing against a dam. By Thursday evening, the dam cracked. She stood at the stove, stirring pasta, steam rising around her face. Mark entered, placed his bag on the counter, and reached for a plate. His movements carried no recognition of the simmering tension that filled the air. He scooped food mechanically, nodded, and drifted into his office again, leaving the scent of aftershave and distance in his wake. Rachel watched the door close, her hand tightening around the spoon. The noise of the latch echoed through her chest. She turned off the stove, left her own plate untouched, and sat at the table. The chair across from her remained empty, its vacancy more painful than argument. The silence pressed harder that night, urging her toward the decision she had avoided. She could not remain in a marriage defined by absence. Yet before surrendering, she needed to offer one more chance. She needed to ask, clearly and without hesitation, for help. Later, when Emily had drifted to sleep, Rachel stood in the hallway outside the office. The faint glow of the computer screen bled through the crack under the door. She leaned against the wall, gathering courage. For years, she had delivered hints, suggestions, half-hearted pleas. Now she would speak in certainty. She entered without knocking. Mark barely glanced up, his eyes scanning graphs on the screen. Rachel stood tall, heart racing. She told him, not with words she rehearsed aloud, but with clarity sharpened over months, that they could not continue this way. She asked for therapy, not as suggestion, not as casual idea, but as the single path left open to them. His reaction landed like a stone dropped into water, creating ripples that reached every corner of her being. He shook his head, his dismissal swift and unshaken. To him, therapy symbolized weakness, failure, surrender. He believed their marriage did not need saving, that her request exaggerated minor frustrations. His refusal arrived not in raised voice or argument, but in cool rejection. Rachel felt the impact settle in her stomach. She had offered him the last rope, and he had cut it without hesitation. The dam within her broke fully then, not with anger, but with clarity. She realized she could not pull both of them forward alone. She returned to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed her hands together in her lap. Her body trembled, but her mind grew still. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of walking away. She pictured life in a smaller apartment, mornings without his silence pressing against her chest, evenings where she could breathe. The image frightened her, but it also carried a strange lightness. Later, when Emily stirred in her sleep, whispering through a dream, Rachel leaned close and soothed her. The child's voice carried innocence, untainted by disappointment. Rachel promised herself, silently and fiercely, that Emily would not grow up learning that love meant neglect. The house returned to quiet. Mark remained in his office, absorbed in work that filled him more than his marriage ever seemed to. Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment of refusal again and again. She no longer felt confusion about what it meant. His answer had spoken louder than any words could. The night ended with exhaustion, but beneath it, something new stirred. She recognized it as resolve. The decision formed quietly, like a seed planted in darkness. By Monday morning, Rachel carried it with her as she drove across town to a brick building tucked between a laundromat and a pharmacy. The sign outside read Carter Counseling, the letters plain and unadorned, as if they promised not transformation but honesty. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of lavender and paper. A small fountain bubbled in the corner, water trickling over smooth stones. Rachel sat in a padded chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. The receptionist offered a polite smile before retreating behind her desk, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts. When the door opened, a tall man with kind eyes stepped out. Dr. Carter introduced himself with a calm presence that filled the space without effort. He gestured for her to follow him into a room lined with bookshelves and soft lighting. The chair across from his desk seemed designed to hold not just her body, but the weight she carried. She began cautiously, her words stiff, as if she tested the ground before walking across it. She explained the silence at home, the refusals, the erosion that no one else could see. At first, she described her marriage as though it belonged to someone else. But as minutes passed, her voice steadied, and she spoke more directly. The truth emerged in fragments, the longing for connection, the disappointment of dismissal, the fatigue of holding everything together. She spoke of mornings heavy with silence, and nights where she measured her breaths beside an empty space. She admitted she had begged for therapy, only to be met with rejection so sharp it felt like erasure. Dr. Carter listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his gaze steady but gentle. When he finally spoke, his words did not offer solutions, but reflections. He pointed out the effort she had invested, the clarity of her needs, the loneliness of carrying a partnership alone. He asked how it felt to say these things aloud. Rachel realized she had not exhaled fully in years. Speaking her truth in that room felt like removing a weight she had mistaken for part of her body. Her shoulders dropped. Her chest opened. The silence here carried no judgment. It felt expansive rather than suffocating. For the first time in years, she felt heard. Not merely acknowledged with a nod or dismissed with a shrug, but truly seen. That recognition unsettled her because it revealed the vastness of what she lacked at home. The session ended with no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden answer. But as Rachel stepped back into the sunlight, she noticed how the air felt sharper, cleaner. She realized she had lived in fog for so long that even brief clarity felt like freedom. On the drive home, she kept her windows down, letting the September wind rush through her hair. She thought about the irony of sitting in a stranger's office and feeling more connected than she had in her own home. She thought about how easily Mark could have chosen the same path, how he might have sat beside her, how they might have confronted the fracture together. But he had refused. And that refusal left her walking this road alone. At home, the routine resumed. Emily's chatter over homework, Mark's footsteps retreating upstairs, dishes clinking in the sink. Yet Rachel felt different. The silence no longer swallowed her whole. She carried within her a pocket of air, a reminder that she still existed outside his dismissal. That night, she removed her wedding ring before bed and placed it on the nightstand. She studied the circle of gold, noticing how its smooth surface reflected the lamp's glow. For years, it had symbolized permanence. Now it represented effort, spent alone. She left it there, her finger bare, her hands strangely lighter. Sleep came slowly, but not painfully. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that endings did not arrive in single moments of rupture. They gathered gradually, like clouds before a storm. Yet once the rain began, the air always cleared. The following week unfolded with deceptive normalcy. The house functioned like a machine, gears turning, each piece completing its task without pause. Breakfast at 7, carpool at 8, dinner at 6, bedtime at 9. The pattern repeated with such precision that, from the outside, their lives might have appeared stable. But Rachel carried within her a secret shift. The session with Dr. Carter had not fixed anything, but it had shown her that she still had a voice, and that she could no longer silence it. She prepared herself carefully, not with anger, but with clarity. One evening, while folding laundry on the bed, she made her final attempt to reach him. She spoke of their distance, of her loneliness, of the effort she had carried alone. She laid bare the cracks she had tried for years to patch. She explained without trembling that therapy was no longer optional. It was the only road left open. His refusal came swiftly, almost casually, as though he swatted away a fly. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply dismissed the request, insisted that they were fine, that her concerns exaggerated reality. His indifference struck harder than anger ever could. Rachel folded the last shirt, placed it neatly in the drawer, and closed it with a quiet click. The conversation ended not with shouting, but with silence. A silence so final it settled in her bones. She realized she had reached the end of asking. That night, after he returned to his office, Rachel sat at the desk in the corner of the bedroom and opened her laptop. Her fingers trembled as she typed the words "how to file for divorce in Massachusetts." The search results filled the screen with steps and resources, each one both terrifying and strangely liberating. She clicked through legal aid websites, read about custody arrangements, scanned lists of required forms. The process appeared daunting, but the idea of staying felt unbearable. She bookmarked several pages, then closed the computer and stared at the darkened screen. Her reflection looked back at her. Tired eyes, furrowed brow, but also a spark of determination. She had crossed an invisible threshold. Over the next days, she moved with deliberate quiet. She gathered documents, bank statements, birth certificates, tax returns, and tucked them into a folder at the bottom of her closet. She researched attorneys during lunch breaks, jotting down names and numbers in a notebook she kept hidden in her bag. She took careful steps, each one small, but together they formed a path away from the life she had known. Rachel felt both grief and relief. She mourned the marriage she had once believed unbreakable, the man who had once held her hand in crowded rooms, the home they had painted together with laughter in their voices. But alongside that grief, she felt air return to her lungs. For the first time in years, she recognized that she had options. She could choose more than survival. Her resolve sharpened when she looked at Emily. The child's innocence magnified Rachel's responsibility. She could not model for her daughter a version of love built on neglect. She could not allow silence to define the lessons Emily carried into her own future. Rachel knew the decision was not only for herself, but also for the small girl who trusted her to shape the world around them. One evening, after Emily fell asleep, Rachel stood in the doorway of the office, watching Mark absorbed in his work. His brow furrowed, his fingers tapping the keyboard with precision. He looked exactly as he had 100 other nights. She realized with sudden clarity that he would never turn from that screen to meet her gaze. He had already chosen his refuge. Rachel stepped back quietly, letting the door frame swallow her view. She walked down the hallway, each step carrying her further from him, further toward the life she had begun to imagine. The decision had been made. It no longer lived in questions or doubts. It lived in action. The courthouse smelled of paper and polish, a blend of bureaucracy and finality. Rachel walked through the metal detectors with her bag clutched close, her steps echoing against marble floors. The building felt both ordinary and monumental, a place where decisions hardened into law. She followed the signs, climbed the staircase, and entered the family court office, her heart pounding as though she were trespassing into her own future. The clerk behind the counter greeted her with routine efficiency. Forms slid across the desk. Rachel accepted the pen, the paper crisp beneath her fingers. Each question asked for facts, names, dates, addresses, but beneath every line she felt the weight of 10 years pressed into words. She wrote carefully, hand steady, filling in spaces with details that once formed the foundation of her life. When she reached the line asking for the reason, she paused. She thought of silence that had grown heavier than words, of refusals that cut deeper than arguments. She thought of empty mornings, solitary evenings, and the locked office door that had come to symbolize their entire marriage. She wrote simply, "Irretrievable breakdown." The phrase felt clinical, but it carried truth. As she signed her name, Rachel expected to feel collapse or panic. Instead, she felt a strange calm. The act did not erase her grief, but it transformed it into motion. For months she had lived in suspension, caught between hope and despair. Now she had stepped into decision, and decision carried its own relief. She handed the papers back to the clerk, who stamped them with a heavy thud. The sound reverberated through her body, final and unyielding. The clerk explained the next steps, hearings, notices, waiting periods, but Rachel absorbed little. She nodded, thanked her, and gathered her things. Outside, sunlight poured across the stone steps. The brightness startled her, as though the world insisted on reminding her that endings could coexist with beginnings. She stood for a moment, letting the warmth press against her skin, her chest lifting with a breath she had not realized she held. Later that afternoon, she sat with Sarah in a quiet cafe. The steam from her tea rose in soft spirals, curling toward the ceiling. She told her friend about the courthouse, about the forms, about the finality of her signature. Sarah listened closely, her expression shifting between sympathy and admiration. She reached across the table and squeezed Rachel's hand, a simple gesture that carried both comfort and affirmation. Rachel admitted her fear. Fear of what came next, of custody schedules, of financial strain, of loneliness, but she also admitted her relief. For the first time in years, she no longer felt trapped in silence. The decision had opened a door. She could not yet see where it led, but at least she was walking through it. That evening, back at home, she tucked Emily into bed and kissed her forehead. She lingered in the doorway, watching her daughter curl into sleep. Rachel knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she had chosen it for both of them. Emily would grow up learning that love meant presence, not absence. The house settled into quiet. Mark remained in his office, unaware of the papers already filed. Rachel sat in the bedroom, the lamp casting soft light over the nightstand. Her ring still lay there, untouched, reflecting a faint golden glow. She no longer reached for it. She no longer needed the weight on her finger to remind her of promises broken. The breaking point had passed. Action had replaced hesitation. And though grief lingered, it moved now alongside something sturdier, resolve. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and cardboard. Boxes lined the walls, half unpacked, their contents spilling into corners. Rachel stood in the center of the living room, her hands on her hips, her body exhausted but light. The move had taken all weekend. Friends helping carry furniture up narrow stairs, Emily darting between rooms with wide-eyed excitement. The space was smaller than the house, but it carried a sense of possibility. The living room window overlooked a park where children played on swings and dogs raced across the grass. Sunlight poured through the glass in golden stripes, warming the floor where Emily now sat arranging her stuffed animals. Rachel watched her daughter, noting how easily children adapted to change. Emily asked about her father, wondered when she would see him next, but accepted the schedule Rachel explained. Weekends would belong to Mark, weekdays to her. The arrangement felt imperfect, but it was manageable. What mattered was stability, and Rachel promised herself she would provide it. The first night alone in the new space, Rachel moved quietly after Emily fell asleep. She unpacked kitchen items, stacking plates neatly, lining mugs on the shelf. Each small act felt like a declaration. This was her home now, a place she shaped with her own hands. She lit a candle on the counter, its flame flickering against the fresh white walls. When she finally sat on the couch, fatigue washed over her, yet beneath it pulsed a quiet relief. For years, she had lived surrounded by silence that suffocated. Here, the silence felt different, open, expansive, a canvas rather than a cage. She could breathe inside it. The following weeks carried their own challenges. She learned to manage bills on a single income, to navigate custody exchanges without letting bitterness seep into Emily's ears, to rebuild routines in a smaller space. But with each hurdle, she discovered a strength she had forgotten. She realized she could fix a leaky faucet, handle late-night fevers, and still show up for her students with patience. Independence did not scare her, it steadied her. Therapy sessions with Dr. Carter continued, now less about grief and more about growth. She spoke about rediscovering herself, about learning to separate her worth from someone else's neglect. She explored the idea of joy, not as fleeting memory but as something she could choose daily. Rachel began taking walks in the park after dinner, Emily skipping beside her, collecting leaves and pointing out constellations in the sky. They built new rituals: Friday pizza nights, Saturday pancake breakfasts, Sunday morning trips to the farmer's market. These moments stitched together a sense of belonging stronger than any silence ever had. One evening, as she tucked Emily into bed, her daughter whispered that the new apartment felt cozy, almost like a fort they built together. Rachel smiled, her throat tightening with gratitude. She realized then that leaving had not only saved her, but had also given Emily a model of resilience. Rachel no longer waited for laughter from the past to return. She created new laughter, her own and Emily's, filling the rooms until they echoed with warmth. She no longer traced the absence in her bed at night. She stretched across the mattress, claiming the space as her own. The ring remained tucked in a drawer, no longer a daily reminder, just an artifact of a life once lived. She did not regret the years with Mark. They had held love once, and they had given her Emily. But she no longer clung to what had faded. She accepted the ending as part of her story, not the entirety of it. On a Sunday evening, Rachel sat by the window, sipping tea as the park outside quieted with the setting sun. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and violet, colors spilling across the horizon. She breathed deeply, her chest rising with a steadiness that had once felt impossible. The future remained uncertain, but it no longer frightened her. She had chosen movement over paralysis, truth over silence, life over erasure, and in that choice, she had reclaimed herself. Thanks for listening. Hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe.